Hi, I'm Noam Wasserman, Dean of the SciSim School of Business at Yeshiva University. I was a longtime professor at Harvard Business School, an entrepreneur, and a venture capitalist. I wrote the bestseller, The Founder's Dilemmas.
And I'm Charlie Harary. I've been working with companies for over 10 years. And that book, The Founder's Dilemmas, and the challenges faced by the 10,000 founders in it is the basis of this podcast. We are delving into the issues faced by startups to help you avoid the pitfalls that claim so many good companies.
Let's get started.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to the show. It's an honor to have you on. Today is a special episode. I'm going to tee up Dean Wasserman to introduce our guest and set us up for this episode. Dean, what do we got this week?
Great to be back with you, Charlie. Thank you so much. We're going to follow up on something that we teed up the first episode of our first season. We talked back then about people who want to become entrepreneurs, the wantrepreneurs, and three of the typical things they should be taking a look at in terms of their circumstances. There were three that we discussed in particular. Two of the three, we talked about potential solutions, how to be able to solve it if you don't have good circumstances. And now these next two episodes, we're going to be taking a look at the solutions for the first one of them. So the first of the three is the business circumstances. Do you have an idea? Is the market going to want it? Is it going to be able to have a sustainable business built around it? The second of them, career circumstances. The third, personal circumstances. Now, we've gone through in relatively good detail a bunch of the solutions if you don't have good career circumstances, how to prepare yourself better when it comes to skills, contacts, and other things career-wise. And then on the personal side, we've talked a bunch about the handcuffs, about being able to live the life of a founder financially before you found and things like that, and some of the other solutions to it. Now we're going to take a look at what if I don't have an idea? I don't even have a business to evaluate circumstances for, let alone to be able to try to be able to evaluate if I should pursue it or not. And so these next two episodes, we're going to be taking a look at two of the things you might want to consider as solutions to that if you have everything but the idea. And so the first one that we're going to be talking about today is about entrepreneurship by acquisition. Someone else had an idea. They built a business around it, and now maybe buying that business and bringing your career readiness and your personal circumstances to be able to build that business that they had started. And so that's the first of them. And then the second of them is franchising, being able to buy a franchise. Someone else had an idea and even codified it and built a system around it that franchisees would be able to take and run with it. If you have the skills to be able to operate, if you have the personal readiness to be able to do it, how that might be another solution to the I don't have an idea. And so today, we're first going to be doing the entrepreneurship by acquisition. Both of these episodes, we're going to do the first of our tapping of experts, being able to bring in and interview people who have gone down this path and have learned some key lessons with it. And today I will introduce in a moment, or I will have him introduce himself, but a former student of mine from Harvard Business School who pursued the entrepreneurship by acquisition path as a way to be able to become an entrepreneur. We're going to be interviewing him. And then in the next episode, we'll also be interviewing one of the world's best franchisors, be able to understand that as an option. Let me just also set the table a little bit for something unusual that you're going to see. Entrepreneurship by acquisition is something that can apply pretty broadly to lots of people. There's something that our guest, Itamar Frankenthal, did that's also a little unusual to be able to help you understand that. It's something that's called a search fund. It's a way to set the table for being able to find what company you want to buy and then be able to become the entrepreneur and the lead of that company. Search funds are where you are going and finding someone who will back you during that search. You are not going to be getting a paycheck while you're looking for a company. Someone who might be willing to back you during that time. On average, it takes about 23 months for search fund people to be able to find a company. Going 23 months without a paycheck is going to lead to worse decisions, shortcutted process, and other things like that. If you're willing to give up a little bit of the upside to the people who will be funding you for that search stage, then that might be an option for you to do it. But we'll also get into some of the criteria of what they look for being able to do that. Overall, in terms of the percentages of the search, when people do search funds that end without an acquisition, it's about a third of them. So about 2/3 of the search funds are able to find some company to buy and then be able to run. Overall, there's a bunch of things in terms of the growth of healthcare and software and services in terms of the search fund realm. Overall, in terms of the company size, the average search fund leads to an acquisition of about a $10 million company. And for those who are more financially inclined, this data is coming from a Stanford survey that they do every couple of years. They're one of the leaders in terms of being able to track search funds. The median EBITDA multiple, so the multiple of one metric of profit, is about 6.0 times EBITDA. And overall, in terms of the rate of return for their investors is about 33%. So some relatively good upside for the people if they're able to be one of the 2/3 of the search funds that are able to find something to acquire, with a return on invested capital that, according to Stanford, is about 5.5x. So that's just a little bit on the potential, the upsides of this unique element of being able to do a search fund. But the other things that we're going to talk about, once you find a company, being able to acquire it, being able to use that as your entree into entrepreneurship, is something that a lot more people can think about as an entree into it. So let me bring in Itamar now. Itamar Frankenthal, great to see you again. Thank you for getting up a little bit early, because the company that he found was on the West Coast in the San Francisco area. So thank you for being able to come right from davening and to being able to be interviewed about this. Talk to us a little bit, Itamar, about your background, your motivation, your path to being able to buy a small business, the background you brought to it, the work experience you had in between, the way in which business school played a role in it, and other things that led to this being something you were considering.
Sure, thank you. And Dean Wasserman, it's great to be back. I'm actually a former Talmud of the deans from Harvard Business School, and Charlie, we had met when I was looking, so it's great to be back with you as well.
Great to have you.
Thank you very much. So I'll start with just the opening message, which is what I had felt was that there are 2 times in your life that you can take risk. And those 2 times are where you can afford to lose and when you have nothing to lose. So when you can afford to lose is often when you're later on in your life, you have the capital, you can afford to lose the money, so you could do an investment. And if it goes belly up, that's okay. You have other assets available. The second time is when you've got nothing to lose, which oftentimes is earlier in your career, when your opportunity cost might be long-term opportunity cost, but short-term, it's the low-paying starting position versus doing something entrepreneurial. And so I always encourage people to think of that in terms of your window of opportunity in life, because mid-career, it becomes a lot harder to do. You have the mortgage, you have the family, the yeshiva tuition. And that's a little bit part of my personal path and my story. Somebody wise once said to me that there's really only 2 ways to make money in business, and that is equity and leverage. Equity means that you own a piece of the action, a piece of the upside, and leverage is the ability to use debt to be able to own more of the business with less capital. There's a story of a person who once came to the Rebbe and said to the Rebbe, I want a bracha for more parnasa. And the Rebbe said, what do you do for a living? And he says, I schlep boxes. So he said, so what bracha do you want me to give you, that you should have more boxes to schlep? Right? The idea is that in order to have bracha, there has to be something that it can be sure on. There has to be upside. And one of the big advantages of entrepreneurship in general is that the opportunity for bracha is there. When you have a job, when you have a salary, the bracha is you'll get a big end of your bonus, you'll get a raise. But for the most part, it's capped by the market. When you're a business owner, the upside is infinite, right? Any business can scale, every business can be big, and there's a lot more upside, but with that comes a lot of downside. So with that in mind, Dean Wasserman, now I'll dive into your answer of my background and story, because that somewhat frames the mindset with which I was going into this story, into this decision to become an entrepreneur through acquisition. So my story is a little bit interesting in that I have almost, I think, 2 paths to my life. One of them is my professional path, and the second one is my personal path. And the way in which those 2 had, I would say, a different shift than your typical from person. So on a professional level, I began at YU studying pre-engineering, eventually transferred to City College in order to complete my degree in electrical engineering, went on to work in the defense sector at BAE Systems, where I learned how to do coding and learned how to do algorithmic analysis and develop algorithms, which ultimately led to a position in Wall Street at Sanford Bernstein as what's called a quantitative analyst, where I was helping high net worth individuals invest by using statistical models. All of that training was really about developing professional skills and developing analytical skills, which came to help me much later. At the same time, my family has a 4th generation business in the cheese industry. And I decided that if I want to explore entrepreneurship, let me start first in my own backyard, in my home, let me explore the family business. And so after close to 5 years working on Wall Street, I made the wonderful decision of giving up a job on Wall Street to go out and become a traveling cheese salesman. And really, it was a wonderful opportunity because sales is something that you have to learn early in your career. There's a lot of getting beaten up when you're a salesperson, and most people later on in life aren't willing to take the blows to their ego. So if you're going to want to learn how to sell, it's something you have to do early in your career. And knowing that is part of the reason I made that decision. I also knew that ultimately I did want to go to business school and wanted to know, walking out of business school, whether my long-term career path would be in the family business or doing my own thing. So I spent about 4 or 5 years in the family business as well, helped build a new product, take it to market, and learned a tremendous amount about small businesses and about the day-to-day operations. Because as a family business, even though you're involved in sales, you're also involved in every aspect of the business. And that was my first foray really into small business. And what I saw was this tension that family businesses often have between cash flow and scaling. On the one hand, the family is living through the business. And so cash flow is important because it's paying for your housing, for your mortgage, for yeshiva tuition, for the food. On the other hand, the business needs capital. And so do you take that capital and you reinvest it in the business, or do you take that capital to cover your living expenses? And so that's one of the challenges of frum-owned businesses in general, is that they become lifestyle businesses and they have a hard time making the decisions that they need to scale, because oftentimes that requires outside capital. It requires more inventory. It requires hiring more professionals who might take a higher salary and leave less money for you to take home. So I was really intrigued through that experience by the question of how do you scale small businesses? And I saw the challenges that all, I'd say, sub $100 million businesses have in terms of scaling without having a full team to help you do that. Fast forward, I had the good fortune of attending Harvard Business School. I think my background was eclectic enough that they were interested in me. And so that led me to, not every day that a Wall Street cheese salesman applies to the school. And so Baruch Hashem, I was able to attend Harvard Business School. I attended business school knowing that I wanted to do something entrepreneurial coming out of business school. Again, going back to that model of there's 2 times in your life that you could take risk: when you could afford to, when you have nothing to lose. I knew that my window of opportunity as a frum person, especially growing a family, would be a limited window to be able to pick up my family, move anywhere in the country, live on a low salary, not have to pay yeshiva tuition. And so I wanted to use my few years after business school to try to do something entrepreneurial. While at business school, I learned about this program called Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition. And the idea was that to be an entrepreneur, you don't have to have a brilliant idea. You don't have to have a chiddush. You don't have to have this great market insight. You could actually just buy an existing business that has proven a successful business model in the market, and then just professionalize and scale that business. And that was very attractive to me for 2 reasons. The first reason is that as a frum person with a family, with 3 kids, while I was looking for a business, it was important to me to have a high chance of success. The upside wasn't as important. What was important to me was that I would be successful in this venture. The second aspect of why it was intriguing to me is because as somebody who grew up in a family business and as an engineer, I actually like getting my hands dirty. I like small businesses. I like the challenges that it has. And so it spoke much more to me. And I didn't have any brilliant idea that I wanted to go to market with. On that first point of, the high chance of success, one of the attractive features of a search fund, or in general, entrepreneurship through acquisition, is the high probability of success. Dean Wasserman introduced that typically students have about a 65 or 67% chance of successfully finding a business. If you compare that to the statistics for startups, the failure rate for startups is well over 70%. It's probably about 90% long-term. A lot of startups don't fail. They just get bought by other startups, but effectively it means that it's a way to get the business off of the book of the venture capitalists. So I had a choice, especially as a firm person who knew that the bills would be coming, of do I go down the path that has a high probability of failure, the venture capital path or the startup path, but has tremendous upside? Or do I go down a path that may not have as much upside, but in the long run is much more accommodating to a frum lifestyle in terms of not being as much of a grind, and B, also having a much higher probability of success. And that's what ultimately attracted me to the search fund model or entrepreneurship through acquisition. The second piece of this I would add is that's my professional path. My personal path is that it took my wife and I a longer time to find one another. We got married when I was 30. And so compared to your typical from person, I was about 10 years younger on the personal path of life, right? Most people get married in their early 20s, mid 20s. I was attending Harvard Business School in my Shana Rishona. And so in my first year of marriage. And so here I was somebody who, as a professional, was already more developed, more mid-career, had worked on Wall Street, had an MBA, and as a personal level, was very much early in my life of starting to build my family. We had our first kid in my first year in business school, my second kid when we were searching, and then the third kid also when we were searching. And so that ability from a personal perspective to search, I also knew was unique to my situation and a window of opportunity that as my kids got older, wouldn't necessarily be an option. I would add to this that to have a successful search, and we'll cover this more later, but one of the important criteria is not having a lot of criteria. It's kind of like shidduchim, right? It's about what am I looking for? A mensch. What are you looking for in a business? You're looking for a high quality business. And the more constraints you put on, the harder it is to be successful in that search. And so one of the important constraints is what community you're going to live in. We live in San Jose. My kids go to South Peninsula Hebrew Day School. It's a wonderful school. We're very happy with it. At the same time, if I'd be living in New York, my kids would probably be going to a yeshiva, not to a day school. And so the ability to make that kind of move to a small community, to send your kids to day school is something that also is easier to do when you have younger kids, harder to do when you have older kids.
And so it's great in terms of being able to leap off into it. Thanks for setting the table with all of that. Let's take that. Overall, you could be an unconstrained searcher versus how you're going to be able to narrow things down. You don't want to over narrow, or otherwise you're going to be left with nothing to buy. What was the process of your going through and narrowing down? Because it could have been you would prize a community where you could be sending them to a cheder. That could be number one on your list, and then you don't constrain anything else. Or it can't, but that sounds like that was pretty open. So how did you, what was the process you went through to be able to decide on focus, industry focus, geography focus, community focus, et cetera?
I would add one more. I mean, did you do any level of self-analysis to say, hey, listen, my strengths are, I'm a great operator, and so I'm looking for a business that's strong in maybe sales, but they're weak in operations. Did you do any self-analysis to see if yourself would fit nicely into the deficiencies of the company?
Got it. So the quick answer is that you tend to gravitate towards what you're good at. And so if you ask me what makes a good business, I would definitely recommend to people buy a service business. It's more profitable, it's more scalable. But having grown up in manufacturing and being an engineer, I really like operations. And so I did naturally gravitate towards that. And often the businesses that were exciting for me were manufacturing oriented, although there were plenty of service businesses I looked at as well. When you're looking to buy a business, people often ask you, what is your greatest competition? Is it the private equity? Is it other investors? Is it other buyers? What's your biggest competition? And what's very surprising is that your biggest competition is status quo. Most sellers who go to market do not end up selling on their first time going to market. And even Rose, the company that I eventually bought, I learned years later, had tried to go to market 2 years earlier and decided not to sell. And so there's a joke in the industry that for what does it take for a seller to actually sell their business? And the joke goes that for a seller to actually sell their business, it has to be either the firstborn, the second wife, or the third LOI, which means the third letter of intent, or the third time that they're trying to go under contract to sell the business. And indeed, that is what often happens. Most deals end up breaking and not going through to completion. Most owners get cold feet. They don't like the final valuation. They decide, let me just run it for a few more years. My business will be better. I'll make more money. So your biggest competition when you're buying a business, you think it's the other buyers, but it's really status quo, that the owner ultimately doesn't close the deal. And because of that, you have to be much more open in terms of what you're actually going to buy. And most people who ultimately buy a business will say that what they ended up buying isn't what they set out initially to buy, and that they learned in the process what is a reasonable expectation for a good business. The three criteria that you look for in a business, or at least our approach to a business, is number one is B2B. It should be a business to business business. And the reason for that is those businesses tend to be less cyclical than consumer-oriented businesses. Number two is that it should have operating leverage. And what that means is that the incremental dollar of sales has a lot more profit than you think, because there's a high fixed cost model. So you're covering your fixed cost with the first dollar of sales, but the second dollar of sales is much more profitable. And so the growth is a lot more profitable. And the third, and this is probably, I'd say, the most important criteria, is recurring revenue, which means a customer base that keeps on buying. So if you think of two business models, you think of a dentist who you go to for cleaning all the time versus an endodontist or somebody who specializes in root canals, right? That person is going to do your root canal and maybe he'll come back once or twice versus your dentist you're seeing all the time. What you're looking for in a business is a sticky customer base. And so that excludes a lot of businesses like plumbing and things of that nature, unless they're doing commercial plumbing, because commercial plumbing would be recurring revenue. Residential plumbing, how often do you clog your toilet? And even when you do you really remember who you called last time? And maybe it's once every few years you spend $100, $200 on the plumber. If your clients are for plumbing to do commercial properties, then they're calling you all the time and you have a recurring revenue model. So those three are their criteria. The other criteria is to find a high quality business at a reasonable price. And those two are a tarte desastre. They're an oxymoron, because if it's a good business, why is it at a good price? And if it's a good price, who says it's a good business? So it's very easy to overpay for a good business. It's very easy to overpay for a bad business. It's very hard to find a good business at a fair price. And so once you're looking for a good business at a fair price, and a seller who is motivated seller who actually will get to the finish line with you, it eliminates a lot of the opportunities out there. And therefore you have to be much less selective. So to your question, Charlie, yes, there are things that I looked at that are more exciting to me, but ultimately I looked at porta potty businesses. I looked at filters for the pharmaceutical industry. I looked at a business that made O-rings for elevators that work on pistons. I looked at a whole variety of businesses, snowplow removal, and they were all good businesses that I tried to get under LOI, because the criteria for me was a good business at a reasonable price with a motivated seller that was B2B, recurring revenue, and operational leverage. And once you have those criteria, that already creates enough of a box that you don't want to add any other criteria to your search, to how you would assess the business.
Just for the people that are, I want just to delve in for one more second on the price. How do you determine a good price? Are you using a specific multiple? How do you back of the envelope a price?
Sure. So part of that is just being in the market and knowing where the market is. And in the years between when I began searching and today, the market has definitely appreciated. At the same time, there is a market of these $500,000 to $2 million EBITDA businesses, where basically if they are industrial, slow growth, recurring revenue businesses, they typically would trade anywhere between 4.5 to 6 times EBITDA. And depending on the quality of the business, whether it's customer concentration, is there growth, how professional is it, you kind of get a sense of what the multiple should be. When you get into more service type businesses, those multiples could increase. And when you get into software businesses, often you're talking multiples of revenue. So software businesses, alarm monitoring businesses, all of those tend to trade for multiples of what's called RMR, recurring monthly revenue, and those have a different pricing valuation. But to your point, Charlie, part of it is also just understanding what you could do with leverage. So one of the key questions is, how much debt are you going to put on the business? And that creates a constraint as well. Typically, a bank would let you borrow anywhere from 2 to 3 times EBITDA. Typically, you can get a seller to lend you on the acquisition, maybe 1 times EBITDA. So that gets you to 3.5 times. And so then you want to do an equity raise of about 2 times EBITDA, and that gets you to the 5.5 multiple. If you buy a business for 7 times EBITDA, you're still only going to get 2 to 3 times debt. So now you're borrowing a lot more from your investors, and it's not borrowing, it's equity. So all of a sudden, what you need to do to be successful is that much harder. Now, the advantage of that is you might be buying a business that could scale. It could be a software business. On the other hand, the hurdle for success is much higher. And that's actually one of the important decisions that you make when you go down this path is, am I looking for a moonshot business? Am I looking for something that I can grow to become a $50, $100 million business and have a great exit and retire off of it? And then you're probably paying a higher multiple because you're buying more of a software, a SaaS type business, or just a very high profitable service business. Or in my case, I was looking for a steady Eddie, consistent, highly profitable business that might be hard to scale. It's hard to scale a manufacturing business, but at least I know walking into the business, I'm buying it with not a lot of debt. I could pay down the debt. The business is going to throw off enough money to pay down the bank. And it's kind of like owning real estate, where when you own the home, over time, just by collecting rent, you pay down the debt and you build more equity. So think of it as, do I want to be a real estate developer or do I want to be a real estate owner? If you want to be a real estate owner, you're buying houses at market price, you're getting people to pay rent, and then you're owning more of the house over time. That's the model I took. There is a model in the marketplace. If I want to be a developer, I want to buy something that's an empty plot of land or a building that doesn't have a lot of tenants in it. I'm going to bring in the tenants, I'll raise the rents, and I'll make a lot of money, but that's also a higher risk strategy. The market has both people doing it. The investor community actually is preferring more and more the moonshot model. And so it's becoming more of a mini venture capital industry than a mini private equity. At the same time, for the audience that we're speaking with, again, if you're buying this when you're paying yeshiva tuition, you have a mortgage, my bet would be go with something that is a proven, successful, long-term business. The business I bought was around for over 50 years by the time I bought it, had customers that had been with it for 20 years. You walk in on day one, you know that you have customers that are going to place orders and pay the bills versus building a business that's 4 or 5 years old, that is in an emerging market. Sure, you could be highly successful. And to Dean Wasserman's point, entrepreneurship through acquisition could be acquisition into the startup world. You could buy yourself into the startup world as well. My approach was to buy a path into an established business, to own and operate and to grow.
You know why I love this for Dean is because, you know, we talk a lot, you know, in previous episodes about the lure of the entrepreneur and all the fakery that, you know, that is out there, that people think like, I just start a business and then all of a sudden I become Elon Musk, and it's, you know, if he could do it, why can't I? And all the realness. And Itamar, we spent so much time in our earlier podcasts, and Dean Wasserman in his magical way is showing how this stuff's hard and you got to go with your eyes wide open, and so many pieces of this. And why I love your approach is, in many ways, nothing is easy, and I don't want to make anything easy, but you could almost take a path where if you limit the speculation, you can really jump into a business like you're saying, and the way you're describing, and I hope people are listening and really paying attention, that you can really come in and input your imprint on it without taking massive risk and without putting yourself in a situation, like you said earlier, where the odds are really not in your favor. And so there are a lot of people with the itch, and those that have that itch, this is a real legitimate path if they can tame some of the rhetoric and really look at the numbers and the stats on success and sort of follow a model like this.
Yeah, and thank you. And if I may add to that point, I'd like to elaborate on some of the hardships, and maybe this is a good time to talk about what were some of the challenges. But I also want for the audience out there to be aware that there's something called SBA funding, and this gets back to your multiple conversation as well. The SBA, the Small Business Administration, will actually lend to you money to buy a business for up to $5 million, and you have to put down, I think the number is roughly 10%. Or something like that. So that means that if somebody has even $500,000 or $1 million to put into a business, you could raise another 5 from the SBA. That gives you $6 million. So back to your multiple question, you raise 2 in equity, you could afford to buy a business for about 7 at this point, 7, 8. That kind of puts you into that niche of buying a $500,000, $1 million EBITDA at that kind of multiple range. And so it's something that if you have the savings or you have the friends and family that could lend you, you can actually go out with $500,000 and buy and put $5.5 million into a business without needing to raise any equity, simply by going with the SBA. Now, it does require a personal guarantee, so you are putting your home at risk by doing that. I do know entrepreneurs in the From community who have done that path, and it was before '08, and they bought businesses related to the housing industry, and it was definitely hard conversations with the bank. So understand what a personal guarantee is and the risk that you're taking. At the same time, if you're willing to take your personal wealth and put it at risk, you are able to get $5.5 million worth of equity without ever needing to go out and raise a penny from any friends and family. So that's important to know, because that is a very common path for people who are going out and doing this.
I have one more question.
Just go ahead, Charlie.
Sorry, just one more question, then I'll turn to you, Dean. I wanted to know, did you do any diligence on the people? So many times when you look at a business, it's really the people, and sometimes the owner leaves, and there's such a loyalty. Or I've in my life looked at companies or been involved in acquisitions of companies where when I went down, when the owner wasn't around, right, then they told me the real story. Like, right. And did you should people do diligence on the human beings that are working the company? Will they accept you? Will they see it as the owner leaves and they're all best friends and I'm out too? And many times when that happens, if you don't have a good team, it's hard to continue the company. Was that part of your analysis?
Sure, 100%. So part of what you want to look at is the churn and the longevity of the team. And the longer the team has been there, on the one hand, it creates a lot of stability and continuity. On the other hand, it means it will be harder for you to establish yourself as the new leader of the organization.
Right.
I often describe buying a business as marrying a divorcee or a widow with a bunch of kids, where, you get married and you're, for this analogy, I would say, imagine you're a single person and you get married, and all of a sudden you have this family and these kids aren't yours. And now all of a sudden you have to be their parent, and there's the teenager who thinks they know better, and there's the kid with one foot out that door, and then there's the kid who's still in elementary school who needs a lot of TLC. That is what buying a business is like. It is really walking into a pre-existing family, a pre-existing culture, and you have to mend yourself with it. And I would share with you that California is a very different work culture than New York. And having grown up on the East Coast, it took me many years to learn how to be a good manager in California, where the way that people interact with you is much more subtle than New York, where people are direct. So yes, that is a due diligence item. One of the key questions I would always ask when I was looking at a business is how many family members are in the business. Because very often you don't find that out till later on. And then you find out, oh, the production manager is the nephew and the head of sales is the aunt. And all of a sudden you realize that there's more family in the business, which is going to walk away. There was a business in Texas that I was looking at where I'd gotten to the point with the owner where I was flying down to Texas to be one of the final 3 buyers for the business. And only by going out with them to lunch did I learn that her head of sales was her husband. She had never shared that with me beforehand. And so those are the things that you could ask, but I didn't get that answer from her when I asked the question initially. It was only once I went out with them for lunch that 2 hours into the conversation, this came out. So the other thing I would add, what's that?
Oh, by the way, you're inheriting my family, so you're welcome to come for Thanksgiving. And
Well, just the opposite, actually, right? These people are going to leave once you're there, and all of a sudden you got to replace 3 people. You thought you'd have to replace 1. So yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say is, V'hinei Leah, it says in the Torah, right? Yaakov thinks he's marrying Rachel, and the next day it's Leah. That is every business you buy. There is always going to be a V'hinei Leah moment, which is one of the reasons why the more steady the business is, the easier it is to deal with that. One of my friends bought a business where the people were performing a very high-risk service that basically they could die if they do the service the wrong way. Think of it as they're cleaning industrial boilers with toxic environments. And what he found was that the owners were underreporting the risk of their business to the insurance company, stating that they were in a different industry. And the day he bought the business, his insurance premiums went up $400,000. $400,000 because he was going to be honest about what the industry was. And that's something that he didn't realize in due diligence. So, there's always an hine le'a moment, a moment where you discover, wow, this isn't what I thought. So due diligence will only take you so far. At the same time, family in the business is a very big red flag if there's too much family in the business.
Yeah. And this is something Charlie already highlighted, some of the echoes from all the things that we've covered before. Lots of echoes throughout this. When you're talking about the relationship roles and rewards, the 3 R's that we had talked about, you just hit very deeply on the fraught elements of having family involved in the business. Now at the parting, we had talked about at the beginning of the business and some of the challenges it had, the roles you're going to be able to play coming in and how you're going to be able to change or not change some of the key parts of it, the rewards and how those are affected by equity versus debt and how you're able to work on that. Is this going to be a lower risk small kingdom, or is this going to be a higher risk rocket ship? The rich versus king trade-offs that we talked about throughout it. And so lots of echoes that we have with there. I would love for us to be able to not constrain you and carry this over to a second episode. So let's be able to delve into several other pieces of it. With that next one, I would love to start off with another echo from before. Central issue of, do you do it yourself or do you go and get a partner? Did you think about having anyone else involved in the search and in the running of it and things like that? So let's kick off our next episode with being able to delve even deeper into not just Vihine Le'a and a bunch of the other parts of what you've done, but let's step back a little bit to be able to get a little bit inside the process side of what you did and the other ways that you were thinking about it, how finding the business, how negotiating. I know there were, I think, 2 daughters of the founder that you were having to negotiate with, a bunch of the ins and outs of a bunch of those. So let's pick that up with our next episode. And thank you so much, Itamar, for kicking us off.
And thanks so much for joining us on the Founders Dilemmas podcast. Of course, you can email us at any time, foundersdilemmaspodcast@gmail.com. Stick with us for part 2 of this incredible episode. We're coming up next as we delve further into this incredible business and incredible story. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.